Hey, everybody, and welcome to the last live episode of Eating at a Meeting for 2024. I can't believe that we're at the end of December, the end of the year, but I'm excited to be here with this amazing woman that is, oh, I did it right, on the screen here next to me, Dr. Psyche Williams-Forson, who is a professor and chair of American Studies at the University of Maryland, College Park, and a leading scholar in Black food studies. She's the award-winning author of Eating While Black, Food Shaming and Race in America, and Building Houses Out of Chicken Legs, Black Women, Food, and Power. Hello.
Hello, and thank you for having me.
You're welcome. And I'll tell everybody, I reached out to you, like a year ago, maybe?
Yeah.
Because I was listening to you being interviewed on Food Talk or Food Tanks podcast episode. And again, I was listening to in the car, like I was telling you before we started. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I have to talk to her. And I'm like writing all these notes down, listening to you. And
well, I'm glad we got it to work.
Me too. Let's just start off. What besides starting with the book, and actually let's put this title up here, How Food Defines Us, a Dialogue with You, really around how food does define us. And in the book, or reading the book, listening to the book, there's a lot of things that food does. It's very complicated.
Yeah, it is. It is complicated.
So can you explain that?
Yeah, well, most people tend to think that food is just about eating, right? But it's not. I mean, from everything from nutrients, are you getting the right nutrients, to what foods are you choosing or do you have access to? What foods do you like? How do various foods represent your upbringing or your evolution, right? What foods do you eat in the workplace? What foods do you eat at home? What foods might you eat at a guest home? So there are all these different layers that involve our understanding of food. And then don't forget, excuse me, the number of different questions and decisions we go through on a day-to-day basis, right, about and around food. So yeah, it can be a little messy.
Yeah. Well, and how did you, in the book, there's so much talk about culture and media and, and how that impacts all of us, but especially for the perspective of the book, Eating While Black. Can you explain why this book was so important to share? And it did, and I'll provide everybody a link to it as well.
Okay, thank you. So Eating While Black came about as a result of my first book, Building Houses Out of Chicken Legs, Black Women, Food, and Power. That was my PhD thesis. And I started out researching the stereotype of Black people and chicken because in 1999, I heard a commercial for KFC. And the commercial, it turns out, was a part of the NCAA for that year. Well, it was a animated kernel with a voiceover that sounded like a Black man was advertising chicken, and it sounded very different from what we tended to know as the Colonel.
Right.
So that happened. The other thing is Tiger Woods won the Masters for the first time. So a lot of things were happening at that time, and a comment was made after Tiger Woods won the Masters about not, choosing chicken or collard greens or whatever the hell those people eat, right? Fuzzy Zeller said that. So all these things were happening, and I was like, we're here at the dawn of the 21st century. Are Black people still being associated with chicken, stereotypically? So I started out trying to understand that phenomenon, which very much involved changing technologies and media at the dawn of the 20th century. Greeting cards, sheet music, menus, all of this stuff had these images of Black men in particular with chicken. So that's how I started my study of um, Black people and food more formally. I had been, doing this work for about um, 10 years prior while I was in grad school. Well, after the book was published, and I was traveling around and giving talks and chatting, I, we started to see a major shift in society. Dollar Tree started to get refrigeration.
Mm-hmm.
Walmart started selling food. Target started selling food. Lots of people started selling food. And more people were returning to gardening. And so what was happening was people would come up to me and say things like, well, I just don't know, why people don't want to grow their own food. And so there was this sort of moral imperative around the need to grow food. And if you didn't grow food, you essentially were not a good person on this earth. So that's what really started the narrative, right, of
Mm-hmm.
eating while Black and food shaming, because most often those comments were directed toward African American people or Black people. You have to grow, Black people's diets are horrible and so forth and so on.
Mm-hmm.
So I just saw it on these different levels and felt like something had to be said about the complicated ways in which we see food as a weapon,
Mm-hmm.
right, to shame people,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's a matter of obesity to, you know, uh, disliking what someone else eats or yucking someone else's yum,
Mm-hmm.
or um, just saying, "Oh my God, I can't believe you buy food from this place, that place, and the other."
Mm-hmm.
Um, uh, we all very seldom are we deliberate in making these comments, but I wanted folks to just be aware of the damage that it can do, because as I started, most people's food cultures, everybody's food cultures, derives from some element of their past,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's related to food, family, or region, or what have you. And people shouldn't have their food culture shamed at all.
No, and when I was telling my mom, I got home yesterday from driving and I was listening to the book, um and I thought about how I make fun of my mom for putting mayonnaise on hamburgers. And I was telling her I was listening to your book. She's like, you are shaming me because but we think about, because it's not what I like, that it's
Mm-hmm.
not good.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It
And
is.
yeah.
No, it is. Some people eat pickle sandwiches or tomato
Mhm.
sandwiches or something like that. Well, if you grew up in the South where, especially at a particular time, and you grew your own tomatoes or whatever, you had farm fresh tomatoes, that's a great sandwich, right? Salt and
Right.
pepper, sliced tomatoes on bread with mayo. Some people eat their fries with mayo. It's not what I like. And
Mhm.
sometimes our faces give it away, because we're
Exactly.
like, oh my God, I've, but it can come down to something as simple as peanut butter and jelly. Well, what kind of jelly do you like? I like grape. I like strawberry. Oh my God, how do you?
Mhm.
So I think it's just a matter of communication and just being aware of
Mhm.
when we are shaming. It could be at that level to the level of policy, quite frankly.
Right. Well, and it
Right.
was well, okay, so yeah, go to policy, because I was actually looking up because you and Tamber Ray Stevenson were talking about policy in the DC area in
Hmm.
your interview at
Hmm. Politics and prose. Hmm.
Politics and Prose. Thank you. I want to make sure I
Hmm.
got it right.
Hmm. Yep.
And the local food policy councils. And
Hmm.
so I was looking up where there was one in North Carolina, like to
Mm.
see how I could potentially find out what's
Hmm.
going on here.
Hmm.
Um, but policies do make a lot. And I spent 22 years in Atlanta, in
Hmm.
Southwest at
Hmm.
downtown Atlanta.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
so being a person in that neighborhood, policies were kind of avoided in that neighborhood,
Right, right. Well, let
you
me
know?
give you an example. I just taught this article again this year Several years ago, as gentrification really started to ramp up in the DC area, and more uh, um, t- late 20, early 30s to 40s, white couples started to move into the city. An article appeared in the local paper about the presence of chicken bones littering various parts of the city.
Mm-hmm.
And community groups began to get together and really wanted to ban or get closed the number of eateries that populate urban areas like
Uh-huh.
Washington, D.C.,
Mm-hmm.
which are usually small, hole in the wall,
Mom
small
and pop.
business,
Mm-hmm.
mom and pop, small business owner, Asian, outlets, right? Or otherwise. Sometimes it's just a 7-Eleven or what have you. Well, they decided, these residents decided they wanted to protest, and pretty much said without saying, it's because black folks are eating chicken and they're just discarding their chicken bones. Well, come to find out, many folks are actually discarding their chicken bones, but they also have a rodent problem in DC,
Right.
and squirrels. And squirrels were, moving these bones from places to places. Well, had that policy gone into effect, or any policy similar to it, it could have really affected the livelihood of a lot of entrepreneurs, right? And it becomes fundamentally associated and imbricated in issues of race, of class, of region, of location. So food just becomes the focus, but there are all these other tentacles that stretch out from food that directly affect the policy,
Mm-hmm.
or laws that could be passed, right? Um, and a more a different kind of example that I write about in Eating While Black had to do with farmers markets and who
Mm-hmm.
gets to vend at a farmers market. Um, how do you even get a premium space at these
Mm-hmm.
markets, right? So there's a lot of issues. There are a lot of issues that are tied to food and food spaces that the average person tends to just
Mm-hmm.
not see, because you're not thinking along those lines.
Right. Well, and just being in Southwest Atlanta and just talking about the farmers market, it reminds me of, I think it's the community farmers markets of Atlanta. They were trying to put that access to a farmers market in Southwest Atlanta.
Mm-hmm.
Well, they ended up putting it at partnering with MARTA and putting
Mm-hmm.
some at different MARTA stations around the city
Mm-hmm.
in some of those areas. But it also makes me think too, is like, I worked at a cooking class school there, and we went to
Mhm,
Decatur to
mhm,
teach
mhm.
the school cafeteria woman how to make hummus and how to make, other food, because it wasn't something that because they were all buying it from a commissary and just heating it up,
Gotcha.
trying to get more local food there. But just listening to your book, it's like trying to put this hummus into the chef's hands of a cafeteria worker who's probably never even heard of what hummus is.
Or chickpeas, right?
Right,
Or
exactly.
any of that. Well, you know, I'm always curious and perplexed by who makes these decisions, right?
Mhm,
Because again, food is very personal, food is very particular to individuals and groups. For example, you have a number of immigrant communities, obviously in the United States, a very hot and vexed issue. But when
mhm,
I think about our area, for example, the DC, Washington, D.C., Maryland, Virginia area, um, those spaces become very much um, hubs for moving peoples, but also they become hubs for community and belonging,
mhm,
right? And so, who's making the decision about what should be fed in schools? Because you've got a hodgepodge of folks there, right?
mhm,
And you've got some people who grew up on canned food. You have some people who grew up on maybe largely raw and fresh foods. You have other people whose taste palates are more seasoned, others for whom rice is a state. I mean, it's such a vast array, right? And so,
Mm-hmm.
what we try to do, because we're trying to feed people very quickly during the school day, is we normalize it. We're just going to feed everybody,
Right.
pizza and salad, or, burgers and fries, or whatever the case may be. Nothing necessarily wrong with that. But when you're asking people to make something like hummus, um, which has very particular types of origins, um, whose hummus are we talking about,
Mm-hmm.
right? Um, and asking a person for whom hummus is a part of their diet, to eat something that is grainy or gritty or has a different texture than they're used to, all of those kinds of things can really end up being as less productive than what we hoped they would be,
Mm-hmm.
right? um, just going back to this notion of choosing these kinds of foodstuffs, every February we hear that some food company has created or unintentionally made a faux pas by serving watermelon or collard greens or chicken, or having some kind of meal that they think really represents Black History Month. And it's interesting because Black people do eat chicken and watermelon and black eyed peas and all, but we also eat sushi and we eat pizza and we eat Chinese food and we eat, rice and sauces and broccoli and spinach. I mean, so when you have those kinds of efforts taking place, especially in the K-12, it's unfortunate that everything has in our society today has collapsed around this notion of woke and DEI, because those are perfect teachable moments to help students to see about, one, a variation of foods,
Mm-hmm.
two, about how culture affects our everyday lives, three, about taste,
Mm-hmm.
because we all develop a palate,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so we miss very clear opportunities to be able to talk about history and economics and politics, because we are very short sighted in our understanding of how culture works in the world and the ways in which material objects function in our everyday lives.
Well, and that I think brings me in my mind to the story of the young girl from DC who was, I don't remember her, um, it
Oh,
begins
in
with
the
an M.
book,
In the
Latricia?
book. Yeah,
Mhm.
Latrice. I knew it
Yeah,
was an L.
Latricia.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And all of the questions that you came up with after reading the article, and looking
Mm-hmm.
at the photo essay, right?
Right,
Like, well, do we know what her actual family situation is? She lives with
right,
her godmother slash
right,
aunt, you know,
right,
you know, why does she want to lose weight, right?
right, right, right.
And what's pushing her to do that, right?
Right, right. Yeah, I mean, so we're talking about the expose that the Washington Post had did many years ago, called Young Lives at Risk, and they were talking about obesity among young people in the DMV, which, this is not to say those issues are not a problem. Where I took issue with the Washington Post is the way in which they reduced this young woman's life, and it wasn't just her, and the young people were of all races, of all cultural backgrounds and ethnicities, various ages. But this particular story was very compelling for me because at the time, I believe my daughter was around her age and had experienced some things in school and been subjected to some comments that were just inappropriate and demoralizing, right, from her gym teacher. um and and so I was very struck by this story, and what I ended up, as I read through her narrative in the post and then I saw the photo array that accompanied it, she was 12 years old. She was on the heavier side. She was tall and dark skinned, and the article reinforced over and over and over and over in multiple captions that she was teased and bullied by the other kids. That was never addressed and unpacked, which is itself it's an
Mhm.
issue of bullying, right, in schools. But what ended up happening was the article pretty much put Latricia's weight and all of her issues around her weight on her. And it
She's
was this
12.
she's 12, right? And so
Yeah.
it was this story about how she doesn't lose weight because she doesn't want to eat healthy and all of this. So there was no mention made of the fact that this young lady was living with a caretaker, right? And she was, and so the part of what you're asking about are these questions that I'm asking, like, why is she living with a caretaker? And how long has she lived there? And, is she in an unfamiliar area, of Washington, D.C.? There are pictures that show her walking, but there was no mention made. Hey, everyday walking is a form of exercise, right?
Mhm.
Um, what the article did point out was that she lives in an area that is unsafe and so forth. And so the way and again in which the article was written very much puts the emphasis on this young girl not being responsible for her health, and then she becomes a stand-in for the entire race on some level depending upon who's reading the article.
Mhm.
And looking at where she was living, there was this angled shot that showed a liquor store and a Popeyes. Well, if we had panned out, would we have seen other stores as well? So, part of what I talk about in that piece is just the ways in which, again, media helps to foster particular types of narratives around Black people, in particular, in my area of interest, Black people in food. And these are issues that follow us regardless of who we are, because
Mhm.
society doesn't differentiate, right, between us regarding class or location or anything else.
Well, and which brings me back to some other stories that you were sharing too about, um, well, one was the school teacher who took the three boys to, or that was from a television show,
Well, that was from
right?
The Wire, yeah,
The
but
Wire,
it
yeah.
happens though, right?
Yeah.
It
Mhm.
happens. I mean, I used it because it happens.
Mhm.
We miss the nuances of not only of class but of age. Again,
Mhm.
going back to Latricia, she's 12 years old.
Right. She's not
You
buying
know,
the food
she's not
herself.
buying the food, but also what was not pointed out is her caretaker was teaching her how to cook. And that particular meal is one that was reserved for Easter and for Sundays.
Mhm.
It wasn't as if she eats this way on a regular basis. On a regular basis, she might eat oatmeal every
Right.
morning or, fresh fruit or what have you. But there was no mention of anything else that she ate. It just showed us this, one meal. And it also showed us another picture of her picking raw broccoli out of a salad. Well, I can show you tons of adults who don't want to eat raw broccoli in their salad, steamed maybe, but not necessarily raw. So again, this goes back to yucking people's yum, and it goes back to taking a morsel of what we see, a smidgen of what we see, and making a molehill out of it, which
Mhm.
results in shaming people. When Katrina happened, and I talk about this in the book as well, when Katrina happened, people were forcibly displaced.
Mhm.
When this past
Mhm.
hurricane happened, right? People were forcibly displaced. One of the things that helps people signify home and remember home is food.
Mhm.
So I mean, I don't know about you, but after traveling for about 2 or 3 days, I'm ready to come home because I'm tired of eating food on the road.
Right.
So being displaced and having to be away from foodstuffs that's familiar is even more discomforting and disquieting.
Right.
And it's even more the case when you're from a completely different region and you may, for example, eat foods that um, are reflective of the waterways that are
Mhm.
close to you or the land that is close to you. Grass-fed beef or beef that is or cheese that is freshly made does not taste like cheese that's been sitting on the shelves of Food Lion or Wegmans or Aldi or what have you, right? And so we have to give room and place for people to live their food lives in ways that best represent them.
So exactly. Now, I there's one thing that there's a couple ways that I see this, or the ways that you said this that I see too, is like, one, you need to be able to read the room, right? And you share a bunch of different stories about you going to different food functions, events. And then I want to tie it back to meeting events and meetings as well, just because we're talking about,
Hmm.
we're on a podcast called Eating at a
Hmm.
Meeting,
Hmm.
reading that room, but also reading the room and having empathy
Hmm.
for your guests.
Hmm.
How do
Hmm.
we, as adults who are planning events, how do we do that?
Yeah.
Especially when we're maybe taking them out of their normal region. Like you're from you're from DC and we're having a meeting in Southwest Texas, right?
Hmm.
Different scenarios. How do we do that?
All right. I mean, it would be, to my way of thinking, the way that we do anything else. And we live in a very interesting time because we have to ask a lot more questions about people's food choices
Mhm.
and so forth now than we did even 20 years ago. Are there food allergies? Are there foods you
Mhm.
don't eat? So forth and so on. I've been in a number of different events where I felt like the mark has been missed. I was at an event a couple of years ago where it was a fabulous event. A number of various chefs were spotlighted. The food was awesome, but the main dish was something that most people don't eat necessarily. Um, I've had this experience even at the Southern Foodways Alliance, right, where
Mhm.
I've had to
Mhm.
say, I have learned to say, what is the theme of the year, and then what is the primary food that's going to be served? Because I don't
Mhm.
eat pork. And so
Mhm.
when I know when I'm going to the South, I need to always ask that question, right? Because
Mhm.
pork still,
Everywhere.
yeah, tends to be heavy in rotation, and that's fine. I just need to know ahead of time so I can plan something different. If I'm going to New England, I have an expectation on some level that maybe I will be able to eat from the waterways again,
Mhm.
crab, lobster, what have you. But for people for whom that may not, and if you have a lot of people coming in, maybe you should ask people, do folks have a shellfish allergy or what have you?
Mhm.
Um, but then there are also things like mushrooms that people don't eat and other foods.
Mhm.
And so I think how we get to that, especially in workplace eating, is to ask the question,
Mhm.
what do people like and don't like? Where
Mhm.
we run into the problem is when we make assumptions based on our food habits,
Mhm.
our personal food habits, and we assume that that's going to work for everyone, right? I
Right.
tell this story, and I've told it in a couple of places about a workplace eating situation. Many years ago, when I was first starting my career, I was on a diversity committee along with another colleague, and we had gone to these meetings throughout the semester to make recommendations and what have you. Well, when the final report came out, it turns out none of our uh, suggestions were really taken. So, we were like, okay. Um, and this was in the late 80s. And so, shortly after the meeting group disbanded, we received messages from one of the higher ups saying, "Hey, I'm having a function. You should come," which we understood that to not be an invitation, but a request for our presence, right?
Mhm.
So, typical Southerner that I am, I was like, "Oh, okay. Well, what should I bring? I want to contribute." No, no, just come. Just you don't have to bring anything. Well, when we got there, long and short of it was that the host had made tofu kebabs.
Not my choice.
Wasn't our choice either. And one of my colleagues turned to me and said, "What is this?" And I said, in a word, it's power. This person had our very existence in the palms of their hands because they were ultimately our supervisor. We had been asked to serve on a committee. Our ideas were not taken. We voiced our opposition about that. Then we were told we needed to be at this event, but don't bring anything. And there was nothing there that we could eat. And I think we spent probably the better part of an hour nibbling on chips and drinking water, soda, what have you. And that's significant because unlike today, where you can get all kinds of tasty dishes with tofu, back then, not everyone was really eating tofu, right? It was sort of, and so these kebabs were made without seasoning. They were just put on a skewer and put on the grill. And so you had all these plates of floating, soybean curd sitting around. And so that's the kind of thing that I'm talking about. The only person who was there who was a vegetarian was the host.
Wow. Yeah.
So what are the rest of us supposed to do? You don't even have a dip. So I look at situations like that around workplace and the ways in which, so this circles back to how we started, the ways in which we make food decisions really can, again, speak to how we feel about our colleagues, right? It can speak to workplace culture. You go out and you get food for everyone who's there and you don't ask me if I want anything. And then you come back and you're doling out food. How am I supposed to feel about that? And yet it happens more often than we would like to believe.
Oh, I think every day.
Yeah, absolutely every day. Or, we order up a whole bunch of things and, you've got a nice group of folks, one or two, even just one, who are gluten-free and you have nothing that they can consume. These are real life and death issues for some people, right?
Right. Yeah.
So I think when we talk about eating in a meeting or at a meeting, that the host of that event has a lot more that they have to contend with than just what's the meeting agenda, especially if food is going to be present.
Somebody just piped in here. Joan just said, in that example, that decision was not inclusive.
Yeah, it wasn't inclusive. It was also very selfish, quite frankly, because as I said, this was the 80s, and I remember when we heard, oh, it was almost like, yeah, well, so-and-so's a vegetarian. Unlike today, where that's like no big deal. I mean, 25 years ago, you were almost just slightly out of the counterculture of a hippie movement where you have had more vegetarian, and you were at an era where, meat was king. Where's the beef, right? That's what Burger King was saying in the 80s, right? And so there wasn't even a salad available. It was just raw tofu, essentially. And again, just too few people were even eating tofu. And so why would you do that? Now, here's the other thing to think about. It wasn't inclusive, but it also may not have been intentional.
Okay.
I would venture to say it was, but let's just say for the sake of argument that it wasn't. In which case, that was just a person who did not have really good hosting skills and probably should not have been hosting a dinner party. Because literally, I think no one was able to eat.
Wow. Yeah. And just kind of going back and then kind of relating that to your story of your friend who invited you all over and she had found that sausage type.
Oh, yeah.
And, your one friend said it tasted like kielbasa, but how, thinking through that, and I had the connection in my brain just like 10 seconds ago.
Well, I'll make the connection as well. My friend was very excited for us to come over, and she wanted us to taste this sausage that is heavily consumed in New Orleans, and her dad had sent some of the sausage up and everything. Well, I think she forgot that 2 of the 4 of us, herself included, do not eat pork.
She doesn't eat pork either?
No, my other
Oh.
girlfriend
Oh,
didn't eat
okay.
pork.
Okay.
She does, the host
Okay.
does, but we didn't.
Okay.
And I think she forgot we didn't eat pork,
Mhm.
right? And so there was no harm and no foul there. She was excited about sharing a part of her culture with us.
Mhm.
And so one of the things I do when I go someplace and someone's serving something like sausage, immediately I'll say, is it turkey? And also, is the casing turkey?
Mhm.
And of course, she said it wasn't. And I said, oh, yeah, I can't eat that. So the one other person in our group who could eat, who did eat pork and does eat pork, said, yeah, I'll go ahead and try it. And they did. And we said, we were all waiting to hear, and they were like, it tastes like, kielbasa. So there are a lot of things going on
Mhm.
in that scenario. And I have since had a conversation with my girlfriend and apologized because we started laughing about it. And she was very hurt because this was something she was planning for us, and she did it out of the kindness, and
Mhm.
out of being a friend. And so there's that sort of scenario, right? Where I'm
Mhm.
doing this as a kind gesture. Um, but again, because people eat different things, you have to ask,
Mhm.
what for, so that you can avoid these kinds of uncomfortable situations, because it would have
Right.
been very different if we weren't all really good friends.
Right. Right. Well, yeah, exactly. Because what if it was a business meeting, right? Or,
Yeah.
a
And
new
you're
client. Yeah.
hosting. Yeah, a new
Mhm.
client, and
Yeah.
you've ordered something and they're like, well, I'm a vegetarian, or I'm a
Right.
vegan, or, I don't eat this, I don't eat tuna, I don't eat,
Right.
turkey, or what have you. So in those kinds of scenarios, what I tend to do, um, because I work in an academic setting and we have a lot of different events. And right now I'm, you know, working with a leadership group, and so we have events once a month. And so I say to the person who does all of our food planning, we need an array. We need things with bread, without bread. We need vegetarian. If there's vegan, get a couple of those options, or just get lots of vegetables. That's another
Mhm.
way you can do it,
Mhm.
right? And that way you can avoid people saying, I didn't have anything to eat, because you just don't know.
Right.
Um, so you offer an array of options that people can take advantage of.
It reminds me of a conversation I had with a local charity here in New Bern, and they did weekly boxes for people to come home, kind of like a
Mhm,
CSA box, but it
mhm,
was at I'm going to say if they provide food daily or
mhm,
weekly, and
mhm.
they were realizing that some people in the community who don't eat pork were throwing that away. So they were getting that box automatically, and they were just putting everything in that they got. And then they were realizing that a lot of that food was being thrown away or wasted because they
Mhm.
weren't thinking about the cultural
Yeah,
relations and how those people leave. So they were looking at how they could actually allow them to customize that box for
right.
themselves.
Yeah, that's pretty typical,
Yeah.
especially of food distribution sites.
Mhm.
You'll have a cadre of folks. If we were to have this conversation on Twitter right now, you'd have a cadre of people who are like, "Oh, you're poor, eat what you can get,"
Mhm.
or what have you. And that's just socially, mentally, emotionally not sound,
Mhm.
quite frankly. We had the same experience here at the campus food pantry at the
Mhm.
University of Maryland, where they found that a lot of the food was being discarded because it just wasn't culturally relevant. But here's the thing that people have to remember. Again, food is not just what you see. Part of the reason that people discard is not because they're being ungrateful. They don't know how to cook it.
True.
They don't know how to
Mhm.
prepare it. If you are not from a pasta eating culture, right, and you don't know how to cook it, even though you read the directions, you could overcook it. It could be mushy. It could be too al dente. If you're not from a rice eating culture, your rice can come
Yeah.
out mushy, or it can come out undercooked and crunchy, right? And so, no matter how people's circumstances are in life, people still have dignity,
Mhm.
right? And we should not be subjecting people to situations or shaming people in situations where they don't know what to do. Very few people know how to cook or eat an artichoke.
Right. I love them but I
Love
only
them
get them canned because
canned, right? Or jarred or what have you, because
right.
very few people know how to prepare. A lot of people are afraid of avocado,
Mhm.
and don't even realize there are different types of avocado. Is avocado a butter pear, or is it,
Oh, I didn't
what
know
is it?
that.
You know, and so I think we put entirely too many restrictions on people's lives,
Mhm.
and that's why I say it's always interesting to me who makes these big decisions.
Right.
Everything from our everything from, and I'm going to say it, everything from our reproductive health to our mental health to our food health.
Mhm.
People should be given the opportunity to and the right to make these kinds of decisions for themselves. Again, I'm going to go back to when you change your environment, whether it's a work environment, a worship environment, a school environment, to a real regional, state, country environment.
Mhm.
So much a part of your acclimation and fitting in and belonging and sense of comfort is tied to what you
Mhm.
consume.
Mhm. There's a guy I interviewed from Toronto area, and we were talking about the refugees that were coming into the area, and he created an environment. And I know there was a bunch of stories about the grandmother figure of the refugees coming across, and they connected through the food because
Hmm.
they couldn't
Hmm.
speak the language, but they could share their dishes with you,
Sure, they
and
could.
it brought community together.
Absolutely. Cultural foodways, cultural continuity is often transmitted through food.
Hmm.
It is transmitted
Yeah.
along with other traditions. I don't care if that's a tea ritual, a coffee ritual, a rice making, or if you're eating, injera or whatever you're eating. It doesn't really matter. The thing that ties you to your sense of home, and I'm not talking about the warm and fuzzies, the thing that ties you to who you are oftentimes is food. You
Hmm.
know, Early in my work career, I would I worked with a young woman. We were both interns in the government. And I noticed that whenever we had lunch, she would immediately take half her food and put it in a storage container, or she would wrap it in saran wrap.
Hmm.
Years later, as I started studying food in earnest, um, well, I was studying food then, but I noticed it, but didn't really understand. I just thought, oh my gosh, here she is again. She's just always wrapping up her food. But over time, as we chatted, I realized she comes from a background of being hungry.
Okay.
And so it was imperative for her. She was used to saving a portion of her food. Now, a person
Hmm.
who does not have that experience with hunger or
Right.
lack will
Hmm.
just see that as an annoying ritual,
Right.
perhaps. Um, and so they don't necessarily, get it, and will make all kinds of snarky comments and judgments about that. And so, and not everybody is going to say, well, I'm saving this because, I may not have anything to eat later.
Right.
Because
Yeah.
why would they?
Right.
So I just think we have to be a lot more attentive to what we say
Hmm.
and how we think about people and the
Hmm.
decisions that they make around food, because they tend to be intensely personal.
Oh, 100%. And I like James Beard's, comment that food is universal. It's our um, common ground, right?
Hmm.
But we come from a variety of different perspectives of that. And I think I ask a question almost in every single one of my presentations is like, what does food mean to you?
Hmm.
And then what is food? I'm like, food is a job. You
Mm-hmm.
know, it's
Mm-hmm.
religious, it's
Mm-hmm.
scarcity, it's fear, it's a
It's
variety.
abundance, right?
Yeah.
I tell this story in Eating While Black about the ways in which you know Black folks are shamed for their overconsumption of foods and unhealthy eating and so forth. But I cannot tell you the number of times I've gone to various functions and people are drinking good fine wine to excess,
Mm-hmm.
and they're eating lots of, expensive meats and or processed cold cuts or what
Mm-hmm.
have you. But because it's a different setting, and caviar has a very different or prosciutto has a very different um class assigned to it than does bologna and Kool-Aid.
Mm-hmm.
um those things get parsed out very differently,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
and I think we have to be careful again. um and you could say, well, one is on a regular basis and the other one is occasionally. Well, do we know that for a fact?
Mm-hmm.
Because the way people eat out sometimes is also the way they eat at home. Because
Right.
otherwise, you're not going to go out and eat something completely new and spend your money unless you have access to means to be able to say, I don't like this, give me something else.
Right.
You know, so food is all of those things. It's a marker of class, it's a marker of time. Recipes change over time, even
Mm-hmm.
though the core of the recipe stays the same. I just had this conversation with a reporter earlier this week about mac and cheese. And I'm like, folks are all up in arms about the proper way to make mac and cheese. And I'm like, the ingredients may be the same, but the taste may change because
Mm-hmm.
our ingredient tastes change over time,
Mm-hmm.
right? Sharp cheddar cheese today is not the sharp cheddar cheese I had growing up as a kid.
Mm-hmm.
And I was explaining to her, I said, we used to get our sharp cheddar cheese off a cheese wheel. And she was like, well, what is that? I mean, so just the fact that you're talking generational differences, right? I was
Mm-hmm.
like, a cheese wheel, I a cheese wheel, you know what that is? So, but so again, we do a lot, um, and we take a lot for granted when it comes
Mm-hmm.
to food, right? In ways that we have to, and we should be very mindful, and we should be very careful, because why offend people in our everyday
Right.
lives, right?
Right. All right. So I want to go to, there was a post in a Facebook group a couple of weeks ago about a planner who was very, very upset about the number of dietary needs that she had gotten and that she and the chef were just over it. Chef wanted to quit and it was at a hotel.
Mm-hmm.
How do we need to be asking the question so that we can make sure, and one of my things is that make sure that everybody has a seat at the table, right?
Mm-hmm.
With something that's not going to kill or offend them,
Mm-hmm.
right? I'm like, if you don't like mayonnaise, if you're whatever, but how do we change that narrative? I mean, I told her I was upset or angry. I put the angry emoji on my comment,
Mm-hmm.
you by the way that she was reacting to it. But like, you're inviting these people to your table, to your event, you want them to be there. Why can we not look at it from a holistic perspective? I mean, why is that so hard for all of us? And I'm not saying it's her and that chef in particular, but as a whole. And I think one of the questions
Mm-hmm.
that you asked somewhere in one of the books is, what is it about Black people that makes people nervous, or about what their food is? But
Mm-hmm.
across
Mm-hmm.
all cultures, I think too. Is that not right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that when you're planning an event and you're inviting people, you take a particular ownership over
Mm-hmm.
it, right? You want the table to be just so, you want the seating to be just right, right? Let's think in terms of a wedding or a big meeting. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
For a lot of folks, it's tedious to have to reckon with all of these various issues,
Yes.
right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to have to do a buffet because I want it to be a plated dinner. Okay, fair enough, fine enough, right? Um, and you're inviting other people. So you're inviting people in. So that means as a host, your graciousness. should probably be on display the most, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that might mean that you offer options in a way that empower your guests to feel like they are welcome. And so let me give you an example. I've gone to weddings and other events where it's a sit down catered event, and the waiter will come and say, "Do you want a beef, a chicken, a fish?" You know. And so you have that option. Now everyone can't afford that option, which is fine. But when it comes to things like sauces and condiments, it's okay to just maybe have a spindle on the table so that people can season their food as they would. For some people, they can't even engage the conversation if the food is not palatable. I cannot tell you the number of events I have attended where immediately I can just look at it and say, I'm going to need some salt, some pepper, and maybe some hot pepper or something. I already know, because otherwise I can't, because I'm so distracted by the fact that I am not going to be able to eat this food. And then some folks will say, well, now you're being a bad guest because you're seasoning your food. Why wouldn't you want me to enjoy it?
Right.
It's not an offense to the chef. The chef is cooking for masses of people, but I should be able to tailor it to my liking. I literally had a colleague say to me one time, don't embarrass us by asking for salt and pepper. You've got to be kidding me. I don't care who cooked. I don't care if James Beard himself cooked it, that's nuts. You want me to be a part of this conversation and for us to have a great time. Well, my great time may involve a douse of Scotch bonnet or jalapeno or whatever the case may be. And yours may not. And so, but there's this real need along with food to control people's food dynamics. And I think when we get into the matter of controlling other people's palate and taste and food choices, that's when we really should examine what's going on with us as an individual. Again, if we look back at the cafeteria situation, it's not possible to appeal to every single child.
Right.
Your goal is to feed them and move them through. And that's why most of the time school lunches tend to be things that are easily accessible, easily digestible, and just get them out of there.
Yeah.
And you get that. And so in those cases, food tends to become function, but it's still a part of the larger conversation that we're having. I'll tell this very quick story, and I may mention this in the book, but my daughter has told me repeatedly about a time in the cafeteria when she was coming through the school line. She was behind a little girl, and the little girl got to the register, and she didn't have any money on her food card. And rather than the person who was ringing it up just sort of say, okay, you can go through, they really began to sort of, you got to take that back and go get cheese and blah, blah, yeah, food. I mean, no patience, no anything. And I mean, sometimes there's this intention to inflict harm, sadly, on children. And so my daughter, that morning, her dad had given her a $20 bill. So she just gave the 20 to the woman. And I feel like there was either the issue of the woman didn't want to take it or said something like, you're lucky she paid for you or something. Why are we doing this to children?
Yeah. Yeah.
But inside of all of us is a little child, right? I don't want to be embarrassed in the grocery store because my debit card fails any more than that child wanted to be, embarrassed any more than the person who's using their EBT card wants to be embarrassed by the folks at the cash register saying, yeah, you can't buy this. That, according to the EBT guideline, maybe not. Maybe this is my first time using it.
Right. Yeah.
So it really does come down to, I think, a matter too of who we are as human beings, quite frankly, Tracy. How do we move about this world? Is our goal to inflict harm? Do no harm should not only be for physicians. It should also be for every one of us walking through this life. And in something as mundane and everyday as food, which we all engage in, that should be a place of examination where we ask, am I being a good person here? Or not even a good person? Am I being a decent human being in the ways in which I'm interacting with other people around something that sustains them or even satiates them or just makes them happy.
Mm-hmm. Well, so there's this. I attended an event last year,
Mm-hmm.
and Temple Grandin was the guest,
Oh, okay.
and she was sharing the different psychological, the different types of people that there are. There's, people that are very focused on the minute details. There's people who are creative, etc. And because of her autism, she eats gluten free,
Mm-hmm.
and they had placed on the table menu, they said it was different types of pork, which you would not have been able to eat, and biscuits, and you could make your own biscuit. And at the bottom of it, it says gluten-free biscuit available upon request.
Mm-hmm.
And what they did, because I'm also gluten-free, gave us was a pathetic looking piece of brown gluten-free toast.
Mm.
And during her keynote speech, she's like, this is where the different brains people need to be working together. Because if you're going to say that a gluten-free biscuit is available upon request, then you need to be giving me a gluten-free biscuit.
Right, right, right.
And it's thinking through that and paying attention to those minute details that can make a huge impact
Correct.
on some.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Years ago, we didn't have these differences in
Mm-hmm,
in the ways in which our bodies receive food, or to the same extent as we have now.
mm-hmm,
But our food supply has changed. Our soils are different. Our air is different. Our water, for all the reasons we already know, right?
mm-hmm,
So we do have people for whom literal putting things in their mouth could be a matter of life and death. It should
mm-hmm,
not be that difficult for us to accommodate the array of people. So this goes back to how we started the conversation about food being complicated.
mm-hmm.
In the mind of whoever was creating that event, if they don't eat what I'm preparing, then they don't eat then they go hungry. Okay, but is that the message we want to convey as a chef? Is that the message we want to convey as an event planner? Is that the message we want to convey as a human,
Mhm,
right? I saw something on Twitter a while back and I remember screenshotting it, where a person was at the grocery store and they held up a bag. They were at Walmart, I think, and they held up a bag of pre-boiled eggs, and the eggs were pre-boiled
mhm,
in this bag. And someone made the comment, "This is just lazy, you know. Why are we selling boiled eggs?" And so another person responded, "Tell me that you are not disabled by telling me you're not disabled." Have we thought about the fact that peeling, just something as simple as peeling a boiled egg, can be challenging for someone
mhm,
who maybe doesn't have the same type of use of their hands?
mhm,
In an anthology that I edited many years ago, Taking Food Public, there was an article in there about a woman who was struck with a severe disability and is, now confined to a wheelchair. And she talked about the ways in which she eats before she goes out in public to eat, because she
wow,
does not want to be subjected to the stares that people would give
mhm,
her because of the way in which she may have to eat, and the way that her disability limits her dexterity or her
mhm,
ability to eat or use silverware even,
right,
right? But because again we live in such a single focused society where everyone's
mhm,
concerned about me, we forget that there are people in the world who are neurodivergent. There are people who are not able to eat and digest foods the same way. People with allergies. I read the sad story about a young African American woman who
mhm,
I think was this Disney advocate, right? Who went
yep,
somewhere and
influencer, yeah,
yeah, she was an influencer and for Disney, and she ate something that sent her into anaphylactic shock, and
mhm,
died. That is horrific.
mhm,
Um, how did that happen?
right,
If you're inviting a group of influencers somewhere, you have to know their food needs and preferences, because
Mhm.
it could be a matter of life and death. So
Yeah.
this is why I think we have to understand and be careful about food shaming, and and especially in our workplaces where there's so many already, so many power dynamics at play.
Mhm. Yep.
Um, I'll say this in closing, perhaps. There's a great novel by an Asian American author, but there are many others like this, where a young woman talks about being in corporate America, and every day, she's an Asian American woman, every day when her colleagues go out, she goes out with them and they order these salads and so forth.
Mhm.
Excuse me. And so she would do the same thing. She'd get a salad and fiddle with it. And as soon as they go back to the office, she would slip off to McDonald's and go get something to eat, because the salad just did not do it for her. She needed something more
Mhm.
hearty, something with rice and whatnot.
Mhm.
But the stories are countless, right, of these
Mhm.
kinds of
Right.
situations, particularly in work environments where, as my niece has often shared, she'll go to the work event and stay for an hour and get some kind of a clear drink and fiddle with it
Mhm.
just to make people think that she's drinking and being
Mhm.
social. She
Mhm.
doesn't. Then they say, you're an angry Black woman, or you're an angry woman, or you're antisocial. And all of those things can affect our bottom line and whether or not we can pay our
Mhm.
electric bill next month, right? Because,
Right.
people are reading you in a
True.
particular way. And
Mhm.
so they're trying to figure out, are you a team player? And, that kind of thing. Um, and so, and then on the opposite end, you've got those people who may go and insist upon partying with everyone, end up dancing on the table, and they're just talked about for a minute, but they keep on moving. So we have
Mhm.
to be, I think, aware. I believe, when we're in these decision making positions around food, that there are a variety of issues that should be
Yeah.
considered.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Can I ask you one final question that I ask everybody? What does a safe, sustainable, and inclusive experience mean to you? And I think you just kind of wrapped it up a little bit in that, but
Mhm.
I don't know if you have any other
Sure.
thoughts to put that into.
If you're saying Psyche, how do you create this kind of environment for all people? One, I think it starts at its very core, Tracy, with asking questions.
Mhm.
What works for you? If I don't know the guests who I'm inviting, at the very minimum, we get these things all the time. Are there any dietary restrictions?
Mhm.
What can I do to make your food experience a lot better?
Mhm.
Um, this is my budget in my mind. This is my budget. What's going to be the least, of, not even offensive, the least way in which I can exclude people? We fruit, vegetables, bread, cheese, at the very basic. Somebody should be able to find something to eat
Mhm.
there, right? And just starting there, um, so that you have an array of options for people, I think goes a long way toward
Mhm.
creating just goodwill and is being a good human.
Yeah. I agree with you. Thank you. Joan just piped in. Thank you. Very insightful.
Thank you, Joan, and
Thank
thank you, Tracy.
You're welcome. I so appreciate you. And everybody, you can connect with
Psyche.
Psyche. Thank you. I was going to say Dr. Williams-Forson.
Yeah, you
Um,
do.
here's her website, and I put the link to. I'll put this in the chat as well. But I put the link to the book in the chat, so you can
Thank
get
you.
the book and listen or read it.
Hmm.
I find it fascinating. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And I hope everyone has a safe and fun and yummy holiday season.
Right?
And
Exactly.
because that's going to be one of the most tense times, holiday, one of the most tense times. But when in doubt, just maybe ask some questions. I think.
Right. And allow people to bring their own food if they need to.
Hey, that's right. That's
Yeah.
right. Not
Yeah.
be offended. That's right.
Right. Yes, exactly. And don't leave us all with tofu
That's
on our
right.
kebabs.
That's right. Thank you very much, Tracy.
You're welcome. Everybody have a happy holidays. Happy New Year. I will talk to you. Actually, we're going to do a special one on Thursday, January 2nd, talking about kicking off dry January
Great.
and veganary. So until then, stay safe and eat well.